The Smith family functions as a system that is deeply dysfunctional yet remarkably stable, not because its members resolve conflict or nurture one another, but because each person occupies a role that absorbs strain in a predictable way. Stability in this household does not arise from health or mutual care, but from equilibrium. Emotional damage is distributed across the family rather than confronted, allowing daily life to continue even as individual well-being deteriorates. Rick Sanchez is central to this system, not as a leader or caretaker, but as a disruptive constant. His presence introduces danger, instability, and moral erosion. Yet the family reorganizes itself around accommodating him. Expectations are lowered, ethical boundaries are blurred, and extremes become routine. Rick does not manage the family. Instead, his refusal to take responsibility forces everyone else to adapt. Over time, this adaptation becomes normalized, turning chaos into structure. The family does not seek to remove Rick because doing so would destabilize the system more than enduring him. Beth Smith acts as the regulator who keeps the household functional. Her role is not to heal dysfunction, but to contain it. She prioritizes competence, decisiveness, and control, minimizing emotional expression in favor of survival and continuity. By managing crises rather than addressing their causes, Beth ensures that the family keeps moving forward. This management prevents collapse, but also forecloses the possibility of repair. Emotional needs are subordinated to practicality, reinforcing a cycle where functionality replaces care. Jerry Smith serves as the system's emotional shock absorber. His insecurity and social failure provide a convenient outlet for frustration, blame, and ridicule. By directing contempt toward Jerry, the family avoids confronting more destabilizing truths about Rick's influence or their own complicity. Jerry's marginalization is not incidental. It stabilizes the household by giving dysfunction a visible, containable target. As long as Jerry can be framed as the problem, the system itself remains unquestioned. Summer Smith represents adaptive competence within the family. She learns quickly, adjusts to danger, and internalizes the household's values with minimal resistance. Her confidence and pragmatism signal successful adaptation rather than emotional health. Summer's role reassures the family that survival is possible if one abandons expectations of safety or innocence. She becomes evidence that the system works, even as it exacts a psychological cost. Morty Smith occupies the role of moral residue. He absorbs the emotional and ethical consequences of the family's choices, expressing fear, guilt, and distress that others suppress. Morty's suffering externalizes the damage produced by the system, allowing the rest of the family to function without fully acknowledging the harm being done. Over time, even Morty adapts, becoming more desensitized, which further stabilizes the household while signaling long-term erosion. The family persists because each role compensates for the failures of the others. Control replaces care, humor replaces processing, blame replaces accountability, and adaptation replaces healing. There is no single breaking point because the system is designed to bend rather than resolve. Dysfunction becomes routine, and routine becomes safety. In this way, the Smith family remains intact, not despite its dysfunction, but because of it. The system is stable precisely because it does not change. Growth would require dismantling roles that currently absorb pain and maintain balance. As long as survival is prioritized over health, the family will continue to endure, functional, fractured, and permanently suspended in an equilibrium that prevents both collapse and recovery. The stability of the Smith family is maintained not only through fixed roles, but through a shared agreement, largely unspoken, to avoid rupture at all costs. This agreement is not moral or affectionate, it is pragmatic. Each member understands implicitly that challenging the system would create more instability than enduring it. As a result, moments that might otherwise provoke separation, accountability, or transformation are absorbed and neutralized. Crises occur frequently, but they are framed as episodic rather than structural. Catastrophic events are treated as interruptions instead of symptoms. This framing allows the family to return to baseline without reevaluating the conditions that produced the crisis in the first place. Emotional fallout is rarely processed. It dissipates through distraction, humor, or escalation into the next emergency. The lack of reflection is not ignorance, but efficiency. The family's relationship to danger reinforces this pattern. Because threats are often cosmic, exaggerated, or absurd, everyday emotional harm appears comparatively insignificant. Trauma becomes relative. If the universe can end repeatedly, then interpersonal damage feels small enough to ignore. This scaling effect protects the family from paralysis while simultaneously invalidating genuine emotional needs. Another stabilizing factor is complicity. Each family member benefits in some way from the system remaining intact. Rick retains unrestricted access to the family without accountability. Beth maintains control and identity through management rather than vulnerability. Jerry preserves belonging by accepting humiliation over exclusion. Summer gains competence and relevance. Morty, despite suffering the most, gains proximity, purpose, and meaning through involvement. Leaving the system would require surrendering these benefits, even when they are harmful. Importantly, the family's stability is not passive. It is actively defended. Challenges to the system are met with ridicule, minimization, or redirection. When emotional truths surface, they are often undercut by irony or immediately overshadowed by a new problem. The family does not deny dysfunction outright. It simply refuses to treat it as actionable. This creates a closed loop in which awareness exists without consequence. Characters frequently recognize how damaged the family is, but recognition does not translate into change. Insight becomes another absorbed element, another signal that the system can tolerate critique without altering itself. Awareness, like pain, is folded back into equilibrium. The multiverse context further entrenches this stability. The knowledge that families, worlds, and even selves are replaceable undermines the incentive to repair any single version. Why fix what can be endured or swapped? This logic discourages investment in long-term emotional health, favoring short-term survivability instead. As a result, the Smith family persists in a state of suspended dysfunction. It neither collapses nor heals. Each member adapts just enough to keep going, carrying damage forward rather than resolving it. Stability is achieved not through balance or care, but through repetition. In the world of Rick and Morty, this kind of stability is not portrayed as admirable, but as realistic. The Smith family survives because it has learned how to live inside its own brokenness. The cost of that survival is not destruction, but stagnation, a system that endures indefinitely by ensuring nothing truly changes. The Smith family's stability is further reinforced by the way time functions within their lives. Consequences rarely accumulate in a linear or lasting way. Emotional injuries do not compound into decisive change. Instead, they reset into familiarity. This temporal flattening allows the family to survive events that would otherwise be intolerable. Pain is experienced, acknowledged briefly, and then absorbed into the background noise of daily existence. Forgiveness in this context is not moral, but mechanical. The family does not forgive because harm is repaired or understood. It forgives because continuing forward is easier than stopping to reckon with what has happened. This creates a household where nothing is ever fully resolved, but nothing is allowed to fully rupture either. Stability is achieved through constant forward motion, not reflection. Communication within the family reflects this structure. Conversations rarely aim at understanding. They function instead as pressure release valves, sarcasm, shouting, dismissal, or humor, allowing tension to dissipate without altering underlying dynamics. Emotional honesty, when it occurs, is often destabilizing rather than connective, quickly neutralized to restore equilibrium. The family communicates enough to function, but not enough to heal. Another stabilizing mechanism is normalization. Behaviors that would be alarming in any other context become routine within the Smith household. Emotional neglect, endangerment, and moral compromise are reframed as inevitable side effects of living with Rick, of surviving in a hostile universe, or of being realistic. By redefining abnormality as baseline, the family reduces cognitive dissonance and preserves coherence. The absence of external intervention also matters. There is no sustained outside force demanding accountability or change. Institutions, extended family, and social systems exert little pressure. Without an external standard of health, the family measures itself only against survival. As long as everyone remains physically present, the system is considered intact. What ultimately makes the Smith family stable is not strength, love, or resilience, but predictability. Each member knows what to expect from the others, even when those expectations are harmful. Rick will remain unreliable. Beth will manage rather than nurture. Jerry will absorb blame. Summer will adapt. Morty will suffer and endure. These expectations create a grim form of trust. No one will suddenly become something different. In this sense, dysfunction becomes safety. Change is threatening precisely because it would disrupt roles that currently contain pain. Healing would require redistribution of responsibility, confrontation of long-avoided truths, and acceptance of loss. The family unconsciously resists this because the existing system, however damaging, is known and survivable. The Smith family thus exists in a state of perpetual maintenance. It is not collapsing, but it is not growing. It is not united, but it is not fragmented enough to fall apart. Its stability is not a success story, but a warning. A demonstration of how systems can endure indefinitely by sacrificing health for continuity. Within Rick and Morty, this portrayal rejects the idea that family survival implies emotional success. The Smiths remain together because they have learned how to live inside dysfunction without demanding better. Their stability is real, but it is hollow, an equilibrium maintained by avoidance, adaptation, and the quiet agreement that nothing will ever truly be fixed. This equilibrium also depends on the family's shared understanding that leaving is not a real option. Separation is imagined occasionally, threatened rhetorically, but never pursued as a meaningful alternative. Staying becomes the default, not because it is chosen freely, but because the emotional, practical, and existential costs of leaving feel greater than those of enduring. The family remains intact because disintegration would require clarity. And clarity would require acknowledging losses that have long been deferred. The multiverse logic reinforces this inertia. When replacement is always possible in theory, commitment loses urgency in practice. The family knows that versions of themselves can be swapped, erased, or reset, which paradoxically makes investing in repair feel unnecessary. Permanence is undermined, but attachment persists. This contradiction allows the family to tolerate harm without demanding change. If nothing is fully permanent, then nothing feels worth fixing at great cost. Responsibility is also diffused across the system. No single member is positioned as fully accountable for the family's condition. Rick is too powerful and detached to be constrained. Beth is too busy managing crises to reflect. Jerry is too marginalized to lead change. Summer is too adaptive to question the structure. Morty is too burdened to escape it. Each limitation reinforces the others, creating a closed system where responsibility circulates but never lands. Moments that approach transformation are consistently destabilized. When emotional truths surface, when someone names the harm or expresses a desire for something different, the system responds by restoring familiarity. This restoration may take the form of humor, escalation, distraction, or resignation. The family is not incapable of insight. It is incapable of sustaining it. Awareness arises, but it is not protected. It is allowed to pass. What distinguishes the Smith family is not the severity of their dysfunction, but their efficiency at living with it. They adapt quickly, recalibrate expectations, and normalize extremes. This adaptability prevents collapse, but it also prevents growth. The system prioritizes continuity over improvement, endurance over repair. In this way, the family becomes a self-sealing structure. Any pressure that might force change is absorbed, redirected, or neutralized. Stability is maintained not by resolving tension, but by preventing it from accumulating. The cost of this stability is subtle and ongoing: emotional flattening, moral erosion, and the gradual acceptance of less. Within Rick and Morty, the Smith family illustrates a form of realism that resists catharsis. Families do not always heal. Systems do not always break. Sometimes they persist in states that are damaging but familiar, sustained by adaptation rather than care. The Smiths endure not because they are strong together, but because they have learned how to survive without becoming something better. What ultimately locks the Smith family into this dysfunctional stability is the absence of a shared vision of what better would even look like. Improvement is never clearly defined within the household. Health, safety, and emotional fulfillment are abstract ideas, consistently outweighed by immediacy and survival. Without a collective understanding of an alternative, the family defaults to what is known. Dysfunction becomes not only familiar, but conceptually unavoidable. Hope, when it appears, is individualized rather than collective. Each family member imagines escape or improvement in isolation rather than transformation of the system itself. Beth fantasizes about autonomy without dismantling the family structure. Jerry seeks validation without challenging his marginalization. Summer imagines competence as liberation. Morty dreams of moral clarity without separation. Rick rejects the premise of improvement entirely. Because these hopes are incompatible, they never coalesce into change. The family's humor plays a crucial role in maintaining this stasis. Jokes, irony, and absurdity function as emotional anesthesia. Humor allows acknowledgement without accountability, recognition without vulnerability. Pain is named only long enough to be neutralized. Laughter replaces mourning, ensuring that nothing lingers long enough to demand action. The family becomes fluent in deflection, turning insight into entertainment rather than consequence. Another stabilizing force is exhaustion. Constant crisis leaves little energy for introspection. When survival requires constant reaction, reflection feels indulgent. Emotional reckoning is postponed indefinitely, always deferred until after the next emergency. Over time, this postponement becomes permanent. The family is not incapable of change. It is perpetually too tired to attempt it. Even moments of care are shaped by this exhaustion. Affection appears in fragments, protective instincts, brief concern, flashes of loyalty, but these moments are not sustained. They are consumed by the next disruption. Care exists, but it is episodic, unable to solidify into a foundation strong enough to alter the system. What makes this stability especially insidious is that it is not entirely miserable. There are moments of enjoyment, cooperation, even pride. The family laughs together, survives together, and occasionally succeeds together. These moments complicate the narrative of harm. They provide just enough reward to justify endurance, reinforcing the belief that the system is flawed but workable. In this sense, the Smith family embodies a form of emotional realism that resists moral simplicity. No one is entirely at fault, and no one is entirely innocent. The system persists because it meets minimal needs while avoiding maximal pain. It is not optimal, but it is livable. That livability becomes its greatest defense. The tragedy is not that the family is broken, but that it is functional enough to remain so. Catastrophe never accumulates into rupture, and insight never accumulates into transformation. The family remains suspended in a state of managed damage, neither collapsing nor healing. Within Rick and Morty, the Smith family stands as an example of how systems can survive indefinitely without improving. Their stability is not a resolution, but a condition, maintained through avoidance, adaptation, and the quiet consensus that living this way is easier than facing what would be required to change it. This condition is reinforced by the way accountability is perpetually deferred. When harm occurs, responsibility is either abstracted or displaced. Rick's actions are framed as inevitable consequences of genius or cosmic reality. Beth's failures are justified by pressure and fatigue. Jerry's shortcomings are treated as intrinsic. The children's suffering is normalized as character building. By attributing harm to circumstance or personality rather than choice, the family avoids the destabilizing implication that things could have been done differently. Agency exists within the system, but it is narrowly bounded. Family members make choices, yet those choices are constrained by roles that feel immutable. Acting outside one's role threatens the balance of the whole. When someone momentarily steps out of alignment, when Jerry asserts himself, when Beth expresses doubt, when Morty resists, these deviations are corrected quickly, often through ridicule or escalation. The system rewards compliance and punishes deviation, not through overt force, but through social friction. The family's relationship to loss further entrenches stability. Losses are frequent, but mourning is rare. Grief requires acknowledgement of permanence, and permanence is incompatible with a multiverse where replacements are always possible. By treating loss as temporary or reversible, the family avoids the emotional labor of grief. This avoidance preserves functionality while hollowing emotional depth. Pain is felt, but it is not integrated. Over time, this produces a flattening of emotional range. Extremes remain: panic, anger, excitement, but sustained emotions like trust, hope, or despair are truncated. The family becomes adept at intensity, but poor at continuity. Feelings arise quickly and disappear just as fast, preventing accumulation into action. This emotional volatility supports survival while undermining transformation. The system also benefits from ambiguity. Ambiguity allows each member to interpret the family's condition in ways that preserve personal coping strategies. Beth can view endurance as strength. Jerry can view suffering as loyalty. Summer can view adaptation as empowerment. Morty can view pain as moral cost. Rick can view it all as meaningless. These interpretations coexist without reconciliation, preventing a shared reckoning. What emerges is a family that is not bound by love in a conventional sense, but by inertia. The past has never been processed, the future is never planned, and the present is always urgent. Time collapses into a perpetual now, where survival takes precedence over meaning. This temporal compression is a powerful stabilizer. Change requires time, and time is never available. The Smith family thus exists in a state of managed damage that is self-perpetuating. Each coping mechanism reinforces the next. Avoidance feeds normalization. Normalization feeds complicity. Complicity feeds exhaustion. Exhaustion feeds avoidance. The loop sustains itself without conscious intent. Within Rick and Morty, this portrayal resists both tragedy and redemption. The family is not doomed, but it is not saved. It continues, shaped by forces it partially understands and rarely challenges. Its stability is real, durable, and costly, a reminder that systems do not need to be healthy to endure, only functional enough to survive. At its core, the Smith family's dysfunction persists because it answers a fundamental question more efficiently than any alternative: how to keep living when meaning is unstable. The family does not seek coherence, justice, or emotional fulfillment. It seeks continuity. As long as tomorrow looks enough like today, the system considers itself successful. This low threshold for success is not accidental. It is adaptive in a universe where higher standards would be unbearable. The family's tolerance for contradiction is key to this endurance. Members hold conflicting beliefs about responsibility, morality, and attachment without requiring reconciliation. These contradictions are not debated to resolution, they are allowed to coexist. The lack of synthesis prevents escalation. Agreement would require commitment, and commitment would create stakes the family is unwilling to sustain. Ambiguity becomes a stabilizing force. Even rebellion is absorbed into the system. Acts of resistance, emotional outbursts, refusals, threats of leaving rarely produce structural change. Instead, they function as pressure releases. Once the immediate tension passes, roles reassert themselves. The system treats rebellion as noise rather than signal, ensuring that dissent does not accumulate into momentum. The family's environment reinforces this pattern. The absence of lasting consequences at the cosmic level undermines the logic of repair at the personal level. When worlds can be destroyed and replaced, when death is reversible, when identity itself is unstable, the incentive to preserve emotional integrity diminishes. Care becomes situational rather than principled. The family learns to live with damage because damage is everywhere. What makes this stability particularly resilient is that it does not rely on denial. The Smiths are aware of their dysfunction. They articulate it, joke about it, and occasionally resent it. But awareness alone is insufficient. Insight without agency becomes another form of stasis. Knowing what is wrong does not matter if the cost of changing feels higher than the cost of enduring. This creates a form of learned limitation. The family does not imagine itself capable of transformation, not because it lacks intelligence or opportunity, but because transformation would require sustained vulnerability. Vulnerability within this system is associated with loss. Endurance, by contrast, has proven survivable. The choice, even if unspoken, is rational. The Smith family therefore represents a system optimized for survival under nihilistic conditions. It does not collapse because it has eliminated expectations that would cause collapse. It does not heal because healing would require believing in permanence, accountability, and meaning. Beliefs the system cannot support without breaking. Within Rick and Morty, this portrayal functions as a quiet counterpoint to traditional narratives of family dysfunction. The Smiths do not implode, reconcile, or grow into something healthier. They persist. Their stability is not aspirational, but explanatory. A demonstration of how families can endure indefinitely by lowering the demands they place on love, responsibility, and change. What remains is not hope or despair, but continuation. The system holds because it was never built to do more than that. That continuation ultimately leads to a reframing of what family means within this system. For the Smiths, family is not a source of grounding or identity formation, but a containment unit for chaos. It is a structure that limits how far damage can spread, not one that prevents damage from occurring. The family keeps harm local. It ensures that pain circulates internally rather than exploding outward into total isolation. This containment is crucial. Without the family, each member would be exposed directly to the full weight of meaninglessness, danger, and emotional void that defines their universe. Together, they dilute that exposure. Even when interactions are harmful, they provide friction, something to push against. Conflict, resentment, and dependency all function as proof of connection, however distorted. Total disconnection would be worse. The family also provides narrative continuity. In a multiverse where identities are replaceable and histories can be abandoned, the Smith household acts as a recurring reference point. It is not emotionally safe, but it is narratively stable. Members return to it because it confirms that they still exist in relation to others. This relational persistence matters more than emotional quality. Importantly, this stability does not imply unconsciousness. The family's members periodically recognize that something is deeply wrong. They articulate dissatisfaction, exhaustion, and anger. What they lack is not awareness, but a shared willingness to destabilize the system in pursuit of something better. Change would require coordinated effort, sustained vulnerability, and trust in outcomes that have never been modeled for them. The absence of modeling is decisive. No one in the family has experienced a version of attachment that is both durable and safe. As a result, they cannot aim toward it with confidence. Endurance is the only proven strategy. The system survives because it relies on what has already worked, even if what has worked is damaging. This produces a family that is neither tragic nor redemptive, but procedural. Day-to-day functioning replaces long-term flourishing as the implicit goal. Problems are handled only to the extent necessary to keep the system operational. Emotional repair is perpetually postponed, not out of cruelty, but because it feels optional compared to survival. In this sense, the Smith family is less a moral failure than a logical outcome. Given their environment, their history, and their constraints, dysfunction becomes a rational adaptation. Stability emerges not from love or trust, but from predictability, repetition, and mutual entrapment. The unsettling implication is that the family does not need to change in order to continue indefinitely. Nothing forces transformation. The system is self-sustaining, self-correcting, and resilient against both collapse and improvement. It can absorb crises, insight, and even self-awareness without altering its fundamental shape. What the Smith family demonstrates is that survival alone can become a trap. A system optimized for endurance may persist forever, while quietly eroding the very qualities that make endurance meaningful. The family remains intact, but at the cost of emotional depth, moral clarity, and the possibility of something better. And so they continue, not broken enough to fall apart, not whole enough to heal, bound together by habit, proximity, and the shared understanding that this version of togetherness, however flawed, is the one they know how to survive. This mode of survival ultimately reshapes the family's sense of responsibility toward one another. Responsibility is reduced to presence rather than care. As long as no one leaves permanently, the obligation is considered fulfilled. Emotional accountability, repair, or growth are treated as optional, even indulgent. Staying becomes the primary moral act, overshadowing how one stays, or at what cost. Over time, This reframing erodes the distinction between loyalty and inertia. The family interprets continued cohabitation as proof of commitment, even when interactions are harmful. Leaving would signal betrayal. Remaining, no matter how damaging, is framed as endurance. This logic traps each member in a moral bind where self-preservation and loyalty are positioned as opposites rather than compatible goals. The family's adaptability reinforces this trap. Because they are capable of adjusting to almost any level of dysfunction, there is no clear signal that the system has failed. Thresholds that might prompt intervention in healthier contexts are crossed and absorbed. Emotional numbness becomes a skill. Desensitization is reframed as maturity. The system rewards those who adapt fastest, not those who question most deeply. This dynamic is especially corrosive because it coexists with genuine attachment. The Smiths do care about one another. Their concern surfaces in moments of danger, loss, or separation. However, care is reactive rather than sustaining. It emerges under threat and recedes once stability is restored. This pattern prevents attachment from developing into something transformative. Love exists, but it is never allowed to reorganize the system. The family's continued proximity also obscures individual suffering. Pain becomes normalized through comparison. Someone is always hurting more, or more visibly, which allows quieter damage to go unnoticed. Emotional needs are ranked implicitly, and those that do not demand immediate attention are deferred indefinitely. This hierarchy ensures that no one's pain ever becomes decisive enough to force change. What keeps the system intact is not hope, but familiarity. Each member knows the rules, even when they resent them. Familiar suffering feels safer than uncertain improvement. Change would require renegotiating identity, power, and expectation all at once. The risk of losing what little stability exists outweighs the promise of something better that has never been experienced. In this way, the Smith family illustrates how dysfunction can become self-legitimizing. Because it persists, it begins to feel justified. Because it is survivable, it is treated as acceptable. The system does not ask whether it is good, only whether it continues to work. The family therefore occupies a space between collapse and care, sustained by mutual accommodation rather than mutual growth. It is a closed circuit in which damage circulates without resolution, buffered by humor, adaptation, and constant motion. Nothing explodes, but nothing heals. What makes this portrayal unsettling is its plausibility. The Smith family does not rely on extraordinary cruelty or ignorance to remain stuck. It relies on exhaustion, fear of loss, and the human tendency to cling to what is known. Their stability is not dramatic. It is quiet, procedural, and persistent. In the end, the Smith family is not held together by love in its idealized form, but by proximity, habit, and shared avoidance. They endure because endurance is what the system rewards. And as long as endurance remains enough, the family will continue intact, functional, and permanently suspended in a state where survival has replaced the possibility of becoming something healthier. At this point, the Smith family's dysfunction can be understood not as a temporary failure, but as an identity. The system does not merely contain damage, it organizes itself around it. Each member's sense of self is partially defined by how they fit into the family's equilibrium. To change the system would therefore require each person to relinquish not only coping mechanisms, but identity anchors. Stability persists because it is woven into who they believe themselves to be. This identity-level entrenchment makes even positive change feel destabilizing. When moments of tenderness or honesty arise, they feel alien, almost intrusive. They interrupt the familiar rhythm of survival and provoke discomfort rather than relief. The family unconsciously corrects these moments, restoring irony, distance, or conflict. Health feels unsafe because it is unfamiliar. The Smiths also lack a shared emotional language. Feelings are either intellectualized, joked away, or acted out through crisis. Without a language for sustained emotional exchange, repair becomes impossible. Problems can be named, but not worked through. Expression exists without integration. This limitation is not due to lack of intelligence, but to a system that has never rewarded emotional continuity. Importantly, the family's dysfunction is reinforced by moments of success. They survive catastrophes, defeat enemies, and endure losses that would destroy other families. These victories validate the existing structure. If the system works under extreme conditions, why question it under ordinary ones? Survival becomes proof of correctness, even when survival is achieved at great cost. The family's environment further blurs the line between necessity and choice. When danger is constant and meaning is unstable, emotional neglect can be reframed as realism. The Smiths are not cruel by the standards of their world, they are practical. This relativism shields the system from critique, both internal and external. What is missing is not affection or intelligence, but permission to stop, to grieve, to demand more than endurance. No one grants that permission, and no one feels entitled to take it. The family moves continuously, propelled by crisis, habit, and avoidance. Motion replaces direction. As long as the system continues to function, there is no forcing mechanism for change. Pain alone is insufficient. Awareness alone is insufficient. Even love, in fragmented form, is insufficient. Transformation would require a rupture the family is uniquely equipped to prevent. The system absorbs stress precisely to avoid breaking. This leaves the Smith family in a state that is neither tragic nor hopeful, but static. They are not doomed, but they are not progressing. They exist in a loop of managed damage, endlessly adaptive, endlessly unfinished. Within Rick and Morty, this portrayal serves as a quiet indictment of the idea that survival is enough. The Smiths remain together, alive and functional. Yet the cost of that functionality is the gradual narrowing of what life can be. Stability is achieved, but at the expense of growth, healing, and the possibility of something better. They continue not because they have resolved their dysfunction, but because they have learned how to live inside it. What makes this state especially enduring is that it does not feel like failure from the inside. From within the Smith family, the absence of collapse is interpreted as success. Bills are paid, crises are survived. Members remain physically present. These markers substitute for emotional health. The system judges itself by outcomes rather than processes, by continuation rather than quality. As long as life keeps moving, the method feels justified. This internal metric also distorts responsibility. Because everyone survives, harm becomes difficult to measure. There is no single moment where damage is undeniable enough to force reckoning. Instead, harm accumulates diffusely, spread across time and people. The lack of a clear breaking point allows everyone to tell themselves that things are bad but manageable, broken but livable. This ambiguity is one of the system's greatest protections. The family's shared cynicism further stabilizes this condition. Cynicism preemptively disarms hope, framing it as naive or dangerous. Wanting more is treated as unrealistic. Expecting repair is treated as childish. This worldview aligns closely with Rick's philosophy, but it is quietly adopted by the others as a survival tactic. Cynicism lowers expectations, and lowered expectations reduce disappointment. The emotional cost is high, but predictable. Even when family members articulate dissatisfaction, they rarely imagine an alternative that feels credible. Better futures are vague, hypothetical, or immediately undermined. Without a believable image of improvement, endurance remains the only actionable option. The system does not just lack solutions, it lacks imagination for solutions. Dysfunction persists because nothing else feels possible. The family's constant exposure to absurdity also plays a role. When reality itself is unstable, emotional stability can feel irrelevant. The scale of external chaos dwarfs internal concerns, encouraging a hierarchy where emotional repair is always postponed. There is always something bigger, stranger, or more urgent demanding attention. This perpetual deferral ensures that emotional work never reaches the top of the priority list. At the same time, the family's togetherness provides a thin but real buffer against total isolation. Even when interactions are harmful, they confirm existence through relation. Being seen, argued with, mocked, or needed is still a form of recognition. This recognition, however flawed, is preferable to the void. The family clings to connection even when it hurts, because disconnection would be worse. Over time, this produces a quiet resignation. The family does not believe things will improve, but it also does not believe they will end. Life becomes something to manage rather than shape. Aspirations shrink to fit what feels survivable. The system's stability is thus maintained not by optimism, but by reduced scope. What is most striking is that this endurance is not framed as villainy. No one is deliberately cruel. Harm emerges from avoidance, fear, and adaptation rather than intent. The family remains intact because each member is doing what seems necessary with the tools they have. This makes the system harder to challenge because it feels reasonable from every angle. The Smith family therefore represents a form of dysfunction that is invisible to dramatic storytelling. There is no final confrontation, no decisive break, no cathartic transformation. Instead, there is continuity. Days follow days, damage is carried forward quietly. The system holds. In the world of Rick and Morty, this depiction resists the comfort of resolution. It suggests that some systems do not fail loudly. They persist softly, sustained by habit, fear, and the belief that survival is the highest attainable good. The Smith family does not collapse under the weight of its dysfunction. It adapts to it, lives inside it, and continues, functional enough to endure, fractured enough to never truly heal. This persistence ultimately reveals that the Smith family is governed less by emotion than by momentum. Once a system has been in motion long enough, stopping it becomes harder than continuing, regardless of direction. Each day follows from the previous one with minimal deliberation. Choices are made reactively, not reflectively. The family lives forward without ever pausing long enough to decide where it is going. Momentum also obscures causality. When everything feels like a reaction to something else, responsibility becomes blurred. Harm is attributed to circumstances, timing, or necessity, rather than decisions. This allows each member to experience themselves as responding rather than choosing. Agency exists, but it is fragmented, spread thinly across moments too small to feel decisive. The system moves, but no one feels like they are steering. The family's shared history reinforces this drift. Because so much damage has already occurred without producing rupture, the idea that future damage might finally matter feels implausible. Past survival becomes evidence that survival will continue. This retrospective logic immunizes the system against urgency. If nothing broke before, why would it break now? What is lost in this process is not simply happiness, but depth. Relationships flatten into patterns. Conversations repeat familiar grooves. Conflict becomes predictable rather than revelatory. Even affection follows known scripts. The family does not lack feeling, it lacks surprise. Nothing fundamentally new is allowed to emerge because novelty carries risk. This flattening also protects the family from despair. By keeping emotional range narrow, extremes are avoided. Hope is dangerous because it implies the possibility of disappointment. Despair is dangerous because it might demand change. The system settles into a middle state of managed dissatisfaction, emotionally muted but sustainable. The Smith family's world further legitimizes this state. In a reality where meaning is unstable and continuity is uncertain, prioritizing endurance over fulfillment appears rational. The family adapts to a universe that does not reward vulnerability or growth. In doing so, they mirror that universe at a smaller scale. The household becomes a microcosm of the same logic. Survive, adapt, repeat. This mirroring is not accidental. The family's dysfunction aligns too neatly with the rules of their environment to be coincidental. Emotional neglect parallels cosmic indifference. Moral compromise parallels existential meaninglessness. The family does not just live in this universe, it internalizes it. Their stability reflects the world's values as much as their own history. And yet, the system remains human enough to ache. Moments of longing still surface. Brief recognitions that something is missing. That endurance is not the same as living. These moments never last. They are absorbed, joked away, or buried under the next demand. But their recurrence suggests that the system is maintained, not resolved. It holds, but it strains. In the end, the Smith family endures not because they have found peace, but because they have learned how to function without it. Their stability is real, but it is not restful. It is the stability of a structure under constant load, balanced carefully so it does not collapse, yet never relieved enough to recover. Within Rick and Morty, this portrayal stands as a study of survival stripped of idealism. The Smiths remain together, not as a triumph of love or resilience, but as proof that systems can persist indefinitely by narrowing their definition of what it means to succeed. They continue, contained, adapted, and unchanged, not because this life is good, but because it is the one they know how to live. Seen this way, the Smith family's dysfunction is not an interruption of normal life, but the form their normal life has taken. There is no before to return to, and no clear after to work toward. The system has existed long enough that its distortions feel foundational. What might look like damage from the outside feels, from within, like reality itself. This makes dissatisfaction feel vague and inarticulable. Something is wrong, but it is difficult to name what right would even mean. Because of this, the family's suffering lacks narrative shape. Pain is not framed as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be managed. Episodes of distress do not build toward insight or change, they dissipate. The absence of accumulation is crucial. Nothing stacks high enough to force a reckoning. The family is always slightly hurt, never catastrophically so. This low-grade persistent strain is easier to endure than decisive rupture. The Smiths also lack a shared moral horizon. Values exist, but they are situational and often overridden by necessity. Survival consistently outranks principle. This prioritization is reinforced every time the family emerges intact from situations that would have destroyed more ethically rigid systems. Moral compromise becomes not only justified, but validated. The system learns that bending works. Over time, this teaches the family that restraint is safer than conviction. Strong moral or emotional commitments create vulnerability. If you care too much, you risk loss. If you believe too firmly, you risk disappointment. The family therefore learns to care just enough to function, but not enough to destabilize itself. This calibrated detachment is not cruelty, it is optimization. The tragedy is that this optimization hollows out meaning while preserving structure. Relationships persist, but they are rarely allowed to deepen. Conflicts recur, but they are never transformative. Love exists, but it is constrained by fear of change. The family becomes a place where nothing is resolved and nothing is allowed to end. What makes this portrayal resonate is that it rejects the fantasy that awareness alone leads to growth. The Smith family often knows exactly what is wrong. They articulate it with precision, irony, and bitterness. But knowledge does not produce action when the costs of action feel existential. Insight becomes another tolerated discomfort, folded into the system rather than used to dismantle it. In this sense, the Smith family represents a limit case of adaptation. They have adapted so well to instability that stability itself becomes suspect. Healing would require stillness, vulnerability, and trust, states that feel incompatible with the world they inhabit. Endurance is safer than hope. Continuation is safer than change. Within Rick and Morty, the Smith family is not a lesson in how to fix dysfunction, but in how dysfunction can persist indefinitely when it is functional enough. Their stability is real, earned, and costly. It keeps them together, alive, and moving forward. But it also ensures that forward motion never becomes progress. At a certain point, the Smith family's stability begins to resemble inertia more than resilience. The system is no longer actively choosing itself. It is simply continuing, because stopping would require a level of intentionality that feels inaccessible. Reflection would demand distance, and distance would threaten the fragile coherence they maintain through constant proximity. Remaining together becomes the path of least resistance, not because it is nurturing, but because it avoids disruption. This inertia is reinforced by the family's shared sense that collapse would not be clarifying or freeing, but chaotic and isolating. There is no belief that separation would lead to healing or self-discovery. Instead, it is imagined as fragmentation without support, suffering without witnesses. The family may be damaging, but it is familiar damage. Familiarity becomes a form of safety, even when it hurts. The absence of external validation further entrenches this pattern. No outside authority consistently names the family's condition as harmful in a way that matters. When outsiders appear, they are either irrelevant, complicit, or quickly discarded. Without sustained external pressure, the family has no reason to recalibrate its internal standards. Normal is defined internally, and internally, endurance is enough. This creates a closed moral economy. Actions are judged not by their ethical weight, but by whether they threaten continuity. Anything that risks destabilizing the system is framed as excessive, dramatic, or unrealistic. Anything that preserves the system, regardless of harm, is implicitly justified. Over time, this logic becomes automatic. The family no longer debates what is right. It responds to what keeps things going. Even intimacy is shaped by this economy. Moments of closeness are permitted only insofar as they do not demand follow-through. Affection can appear briefly, intensely, and then vanish without consequence. Sustained care would require consistency, and consistency would introduce expectations the system cannot meet. The family learns to express care in bursts rather than commitments. The cumulative effect is a household that is emotionally active but emotionally shallow. Feelings are frequent, intense, and transient. Nothing settles long enough to reshape behavior. The family experiences life as a series of reactions rather than a coherent narrative. This fragmentation prevents both despair and growth. There is no time to fall apart and no space to heal. What is striking is how little this stability relies on denial. The Smiths are not pretending to be healthy. They openly acknowledge their dysfunction. But acknowledgement has been stripped of its transformative power. Naming the problem becomes another ritual that changes nothing. Awareness is metabolized by the system and rendered inert. In this way, the family embodies a form of existential accommodation. They do not reject meaning outright, but they no longer expect it to emerge from relationships, repair, or progress. Meaning is localized to survival, to making it through the next crisis intact. Anything beyond that feels speculative, even irresponsible. Within Rick and Morty, this portrayal resists the comforting notion that dysfunction must eventually resolve. The Smith family shows how systems can persist indefinitely by redefining success downward, by accepting less and calling it realism. Their stability is not the absence of pain, but the mastery of living with it. They continue not because they are reconciled, redeemed, or healed, but because they have learned how to exist without demanding those things. The family holds together through habit, proximity, and shared avoidance, suspended in a state where survival has become the highest and only form of achievement. Over time, this redefinition of success reshapes how the Smith family understands responsibility to one another. Responsibility narrows to maintenance. Keep the household running, keep people alive, keep crises contained. Anything beyond that, emotional repair, moral reckoning, long-term care, is treated as optional or unrealistic. The family does not ask whether members are thriving, only whether they are still present. Presence becomes the sole metric of commitment. This shift subtly alters the meaning of care. Care is no longer about meeting needs, but about preventing disappearance. As long as no one leaves permanently, the system considers itself intact. Emotional neglect can coexist with loyalty, because loyalty is measured spatially rather than relationally. Being in the same house, the same orbit, substitutes for emotional engagement. The family remains together, but rarely truly with one another. The Smiths' shared avoidance of permanence also plays a crucial role. Permanence would require ownership of harm, of choice, of consequence. In a multiverse where everything is theoretically reversible, permanence feels both artificial and dangerous. By treating nothing as final, the family avoids the grief and accountability that finality would demand. This avoidance protects them from overwhelming loss, but it also prevents closure of any kind. As a result, the family lives in a perpetual interim. Nothing is resolved because nothing is allowed to conclude. Conflicts fade rather than end. Relationships persist rather than deepen. The family exists in a state of emotional suspension where time passes but nothing settles. This suspension is uncomfortable, but it is familiar. And familiarity has become more important than comfort. What makes this dynamic especially resilient is that it distributes suffering in a way that feels manageable. No single member carries the entire burden. Pain is shared unevenly, shifted from one person to another depending on circumstance. This diffusion prevents collapse. It also prevents recognition. When everyone is hurt a little, no one's pain becomes decisive enough to force change. The system also relies on constant motion. There is always another crisis, another distraction, another demand. Stillness would invite reflection, and reflection would invite grief. By staying in motion, physically, emotionally, narratively, the family avoids confronting what has accumulated beneath the surface. Movement becomes a defense against meaning. Importantly, this is not presented as ignorance or stupidity. The Smiths are perceptive, articulate, and often painfully aware of their own dysfunction. But awareness without structure leads nowhere. Insight requires a framework for action, and the family has none that does not threaten its own survival. Knowing what is wrong becomes another discomfort to endure, rather than a catalyst for change. The family's endurance, then, is not heroic. It is procedural. It emerges from repetition, from habit, from the quiet agreement that whatever this is, it is livable. The cost of imagining something better feels too high, because imagining better implies the possibility of loss, failure, or separation. Endurance is safer than aspiration. In this sense, the Smith family is not broken in a way that demands repair. It is optimized for a world where repair is not rewarded. Their dysfunction mirrors the logic of their universe: unstable, indifferent, survivable. The family adapts to that logic so thoroughly that it becomes indistinguishable from it. Within Rick and Morty, the Smith family stands as an example of how stability can be achieved without healing, and how survival can become an end in itself. They remain together, not because they have resolved their conflicts or learned to care better, but because they have learned how to continue. Their system holds, not gently, not kindly, but effectively, demonstrating that sometimes the most unsettling outcome is not collapse, but persistence without change.